Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. My name is Sam Otten from the University of Missouri, and joining me today is Alina Kadluba, who's from the Technical University of Munich in Germany. Alina, thanks so much for speaking with me.
Thank you, Lot, for inviting me. I'm very happy to join you on the podcast today.
Yeah, Alina's here because I saw her article in Educational Studies in Mathematics, and I wanted to talk to her a little bit about some of the ideas and what they found in this study. The article is called How Much C is in TPACK, focusing on the C in the TPACK. And this is a systematic review on the assessment of TPACK in mathematics. So, Alina, to get into this study, I first want to just set some groundwork and make sure the listeners are familiar with TPACK. So maybe you could just introduce us to the framework of TPACK. And then why do you think it's important to think about TPACK in mathematics specifically?
Yeah, so TPACK is an acronym and it stands for Technological Pedagogical Content Knowledge. It was introduced at the beginning of the 21st century and it was conceptualized by Mishra and Köhler in 2006. And the TPACK framework consists of 7 different knowledge facets. So maybe you're familiar with the Schulman model, where you have the content knowledge, the pedagogical knowledge, and the pedagogical content knowledge, which is the intersection of these 2 knowledge facets. And due to the increasing technology use in classroom, Köhler and Mishra added the 3rd basic knowledge facet, the technological knowledge. And this leads to the technological pedagogical knowledge and technological content knowledge. And then in the middle of this framework, in the center, you have the technological pedagogical content knowledge. And this is the knowledge teachers need to teach a specific content with digital technology. And this actually leads us already to your second question. You asked why it's important to think about TPACK in mathematics specifically, because in TPACK you have this C, and C stands for content, which is why TPACK is by definition content specific. And you can also think about this in terms of different teachers. So if you have an English teacher, for example, or a math teacher, they need different kind of knowledge when they want to use digital technologies in their instruction. Assume, for example, an English teacher using text progressing programs for writing tasks or large language models with advanced feedback features to correct grammar and spelling and refine students' writing style, for example. And on the other hand, you have mathematics teachers, and they might use dynamic geometry softwares to address specific misconceptions about functions or use visualizations to illustrate mathematical objects. So you see that the kind of knowledge different teachers need is strongly depends on the subject they are teaching. And that's why, we focus on what mathematics teachers need when they use digital technology.
Great. And this article in Ed Studies in Math, which is in volume 118, it's a literature review that looks across a variety of studies and especially assessments of TPACK. So I wonder what it was that led you and your co-authors to want to do a systematic literature review. And then how did you frame that review? Because I imagine there's a lot of different approaches or a lot of different angles you could take at the literature review.
Yeah, it's funny because originally we did not plan to write a review. So actually I wanted to investigate the role of teachers in technology enhanced learning settings. This is kind of my PhD project. And for this project, I wanted to assess mathematics teachers' TPACK. So I was looking for a knowledge test, to assess this mathematics teachers' TPACK for another study. But when I searched in the literature, I noticed that there weren't many knowledge tests out there because most of the studies used self-reports or other assessment tools as, for example, observation assessment. But I couldn't find a solid knowledge test to assess mathematics teachers' TPACK and also no overview over which assessment instruments already exist. So such an overview would have been extremely helpful for me because then I would know which instruments are already out there and available. But since such an overview didn't exist, I thought, okay, let's do this overview by ourselves. And then we just started to do this systematic literature review on the assessment of mathematics teachers' TPACK. Yeah, and you asked me how we framed our review. So I would say we have a strong mathematics education perspective. So we focus on how well previous assessment instruments address the mathematics content, as I already mentioned. And we also ask how do researchers on mathematics education and mathematics teachers benefit from such a review and of more valid TPACK instruments. And that's why I think the perspective is from a mathematics education perspective.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I definitely know the feeling of wanting to really wrap your head around how has this been measured? What are the different assessments or approaches people have taken to the concept? And so in this article, we get a good sense of how that happens with TPACK, especially in mathematics. I did want to remind the listeners that there was a past episode, 2409, with Jonathan Bostic, where he talks about mathedmeasures.org, which collects a lot of math ed measures. But that one, they pulled those measures from certain math ed journals. And this one I think is nice because you have a target of interest. You're really looking at TPACK. And so you can look at across a lot of different journals, not just math ed journals, some teacher ed journals, some education technology journals, and get a more broad view of how TPACK has been approached. So I think that's nice and complimentary. But if listeners are also wondering how has something been measured, you can check mathedmeasures.org and see if maybe it's shown up in some math ed journals. But going into your literature review, I wonder if you could just start by letting us know the general trends that you and your team saw across the literature.
Yeah. So I would say we saw different trends. So first of all, the interest in TPACK assessment seems to grow over time because there were almost linear increase of assessment instruments per year. And we also saw that most instruments still rely on self-reports. That's what I, yeah, kind of already thought because I found a lot of self-reports before doing the literature review. But it's still kind of surprising because, yeah, TPACK is a knowledge facet, and one would maybe expect that researchers would use knowledge tests to assess it. But yeah, many researchers used self-reports or also observational instruments. Even though self-reports have been criticized for a good reason because they might reflect confidence or self-efficacy rather than actual knowledge. And yeah, this is also supported by low correlations between self-assessed and externally assessed TPACK in previous studies. We also did a study by ourselves. We published it 1 year ago, and we also found a low correlation between self and externally assessed mathematics teachers TPACK. So yeah, so there is criticism to use self-reports, but a lot of researchers use self-reports. And what we also found a trend that not a lot of TPACK assessment instruments specified in the content and in the technology they mention in their assessment instrument. So many instruments ask about teaching content with technology in general, but without saying which content or which technology they mean. And that's a problem because, as I already said, teaching math with digital technology is very different to teaching English, for example, with digital technologies. And also within the subject, for example, teaching fractions with digital technology might be different to teaching functions with digital technologies. So, yeah, we think it's kind of a problem that the TPACK assessment instruments are not specific, but we found the trend that there is a lack of specificity.
Yeah, and to me, that was one of the real takeaways from this study. And I'll ask you later for what you think the takeaways are, and you'll know better than I do. But to me, that focus on specificity was really, I think, one of the key insights. And as you reveal the results of your analysis, you kind of go through the level of specificity in different ways. So I wonder if you could maybe tell us more about that specificity that you saw when you did this careful analysis. And maybe you can, like in the article, you can kind of talk about the specificity with regard to math, or the specificity with regard to pedagogy, or the specificity with regard to technology. Because with TPACK, we have all of those working together and circling. And so you can kind of think about how specific did the studies or did the assessments get on each of those dimensions.
Yeah, that was a very nice introduction actually, because we had these three dimensions and we distinguished between four different levels of specificity. So, four levels of content specificity, pedagogy specificity, and technology specificity. And yeah, as I already mentioned, regarding content and technology, there was not a lot of specificity. So many assessment instruments instruments just asked for the knowledge about content or about mathematics to use technology or digital technology. So without specifying which content they mean or even which specific action of content they mean. An example for a specific content would be fractions or functions, and an example for a specific action with content would be drawing a circle, for example. But we didn't find a lot of assessment instruments that went into detail regarding content. We found similar results for the technological specificity. So many instruments just mentioned the term technology or digital technology without mentioning, for example, dynamic geometry systems or cars or things like that or GeoGebra, but it just stuck with the term technology or digital technology. And for pedagogy, it was a bit more specific. So there they did not just use the term pedagogy or teaching, but they specified which teaching approach they meant by, for example, mentioning group work or identifying misconceptions of students. So they were a bit more specific about pedagogy, which is kind of interesting because I think all of the three dimensions are equally important, and we should not only be specific about pedagogy, but also about which content and which technology is meant.
Yeah, I agree. And I can definitely understand from an assessment perspective, or you're trying to measure something that you kind of keep it general and you get some sort of measure that you call like, okay, that's sort of general. It's going to capture a lot of things. But I also wonder theoretically if you can really have general knowledge or is all knowledge actually specific? And you're to say general knowledge is only actually just trying to abstract from a lot of different specific knowledge or something. I feel like if you really drill down into what does somebody really know, you always kind of end up with something fairly specific that they know. And they maybe know a lot of specific things, or they maybe know connections across specific things. But for me, it's a little bit hard to wrap my head around what it would mean to just have like general math knowledge without having actually, no, it's made up of specific math knowledge. Same for like technology. Like, what does it mean to really have general technology knowledge versus like, no, I just have an assortment of technology knowledge that I have. So I'm also just kind of playing around in my mind this idea of what really is it to have general knowledge.
Yeah, that's very interesting because of course this leads to the question how specific you want to be, because you can always be more specific and then
Hmm.
you can ask about functions and then about solving equations and solving specific equations, for example. So I think it's you have to stop somewhere.
Yeah.
You can't reach the highest amount of specificity, but at least on my opinion, I think the current TPACK assessments are too unspecific.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. So I wonder if you step back, what do you think this literature review has revealed for the field, or maybe you can help us like coalesce some of these big ideas that you think this contributes to the field?
So I think from a very general perspective, you could say that there are still limitations and challenges in TPACK assessment, and we still lack specific and valid assessment instruments, especially when it comes to knowledge tests that focus on particular math content, for example. But I think there are also some more hidden or not so obvious contributions to the field. Because as I already said, many self-reports are used to assess mathematics teachers' TPACK, even though we already know that they might assess confidence or self-efficacy rather than knowledge, for example. And I think that's especially problematic when this self-assessment is systematically influenced by gender, social background, age, or teaching experience, for example. So I think this gives us a reason to interpret previous studies that used self-reports to assess mathematics teachers' TPACK with caution, because just think about a study that reveals that female teachers have less TPACK than their male counterparts, for example. But this study used self-reports. And it might be that the female teachers just have lower confidence to use technology for teaching and not less knowledge. And if the study states that the female teachers have less TPACK, this might be misleading. And yeah, so I think one of the results of our study is to be careful about studies that used self-reports to assess TPACK.
Yeah, you mentioned one possibility there, which is the confidence, but it also could be accuracy. It could be that women are generally more accurate in how they self-report their TPAC, and maybe men are a little bit less accurate where they overinflate what they think their TPAC is.
Yeah, that could be as well. So I think it's difficult to interpret the results as knowledge. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
And also, another result or another contribution to the field is that it seems that many researchers may assume that teachers only need to know how to teach with digital technology without addressing a specific content that is taught. But if we think about just teaching with digital technology, this would include, for example, knowing which digital tools are appropriate for assessing students' current understanding, or understanding how to handle technical issues during lessons, or knowing how to use digital technology to increase student motivation. So this would be like knowledge teachers need to use digital technology in instruction without considering any content. But especially in mathematics, I think instructional approaches are very different across different content areas. So students may have different misconceptions or require distinct prior knowledge or need to be cognitively activated in specific ways depending on the content. And that's, of course, also true for using digital technology. So we need to consider the content that's being taught when we think about teaching mathematics with technology. And that's why I think the second main contribution, if you want to say it like that, is that it's not enough just to think about teaching with digital technology without considering the content.
That's great. And then for yourself, I'm curious what this has prompted in your own thinking, or if you have some next steps that you're doing to follow up on this work.
Yeah, so I would say one clear conclusion of the literature review is that we need more valid assessment instruments. So this means that one obvious next step for me in my future research would be to develop maybe a knowledge test to assess mathematics teachers' TPACK. But for me, I would like to answer this question maybe in a broader context, because in a very general sense, and maybe this leads away from the question a little bit, this review spurred me to think about how many different components are connected in teaching and learning. So in terms of TPACK, it means it's not enough to only think about the knowledge about digital technology teachers need, or the knowledge about pedagogical approaches, or the knowledge about the learning content, but it's the interaction of all of these components that are important. So this, of course, can be seen in a broader perspective of teaching and learning, because in a similar sense, you could argue teachers' professional knowledge is important for teaching with digital technology in math instruction, but also the way teachers use the digital tools are important, and the way students learn with this digital tool. So for me, it's kind of interesting to think about this whole teaching and learning with digital technology in a broader perspective, and trying to understand the broader relationships between this professional knowledge. So when we have valid assessment instruments and we assess this mathematics teacher's TPACK, it's interesting in the next step to think how this knowledge translates to teaching practices with digital technology, for example, and how students learn depending on these different teaching practices, for example. So I think, yeah, these are the directions I plan to go in the future.
Well, thank you so much for those insights into the article. And again, that's available in Educational Studies in Mathematics. And I know, this was part of your team, so I want to make sure you get a chance to also mention your collaborators.
Of course, without my wonderful co-authors, it wouldn't have been possible to do this whole literature review. So I would like to mention Christian Schoens, who is actually Dr. Christian Schoens right now, because he finished his PhD a few weeks ago.
Oh, great.
And yeah, Professor Dr. Anselm Strohmeier and Professor Dr. Andreas Obersteiner, who is my supervisor. And all of them did an amazing work, and they supported me a lot during the time when I did my literature review.
Hmm. Well, I want to finish by asking you a different sort of question. I often try to get to know somebody a little bit more by asking if you were not in mathematics education and if you weren't exploring these ideas in our field, what might you do as an alternative career?
Yeah, that's a funny question. I think actually I would like to do something hands-on or like practical work, such as felling wood in the forest, for example, because
Oh.
I like to be in nature.
Hmm.
And I also thought about being a mechanic. I think it must be very interesting, not because I'm so much into cars, but actually because I love old Volkswagen Beetles, especially the orange ones. And I would really like to learn how they work and how to repair them. And then I probably would go for long drives through the mountains and thereby maybe still think a little bit about teaching and learning mathematics.
Can't quite get away from it entirely. Huh?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I've been speaking with Alina Kadluba from the Technical University of Munich. Alina, thanks so much for sharing your work.
Yeah, thanks for having me.